It's June 2025 and this is video number 339. There is, in case you hadn't noticed, a plan to reduce the world's population by 9/10. Almost everything that is happening, and these days nothing happens by accident or coincidence, is driven by that conspiracy. Sadly, too many people assume that all these things are a result of individual occurrences of incompetence, greed or stupidity. They are not. We are all victims and prisoners to be of the world they have designed for us, a world being prepared with malignant contempt rather than quiet, respectful humanity. The global warming myth, the massive immigration programs, the end of medicine, the destruction of farming and economies around the world are all part of the plan. Farmers in the UK are being paid £250 per acre, not to grow food, but to use their land to grow nettles, brambles and a few wild flowers. It's called rewilding, and the aim is to push up food prices and increase the number of people dying of hunger. Food prices around the world have soared, and countless millions in Africa have already died. Energy prices have soared too, as the absurd and unnecessary net zero campaign has progressed. Millions die of cold as a result. What a pity global warming isn't real and we could all have some sunshine. Wars are spreading and huge amounts of money are being diverted into arms and armed forces, often without good reason. Vaccines are promoted and given in huge numbers without much effort to examine side effects and dangers. Even when dangers are clearly apparent, as with the COVID-19 vaccine, doctors ignore the warnings and continue to jab patients by the thousand. Many doctors didn't have the jab themselves, but they've happily taken huge sums of money to give the vaccine to their trusting patients. Drug companies are crooked, it's what they do best, but the companies have corrupted governments and they now own the medical establishment. The aim of the Depopulation plan is to gain control of the world, set up a world government and lead us via the horrors of net zero into the wilderness of the Great Reset. A subsidiary aim is to save money by dramatically cutting the amount of money spent on pensions, benefits, welfare and medical care. We've entered our own killing fields, and this is truly the slaughter of the innocent. It began with the Liverpool Care Pathway, one of the most shameful and inhumane programs ever introduced in medicine. It was simple enough. Patients whom doctors or nurses thought were too old were literally starved of food and drink. They were denied medicines they needed too. Doctors and nurses who were employed to save patients were doing the opposite. It was legalised murder. The Liverpool Care Pathway was condemned, but it still continues. The problem with it, as far as the establishment was concerned, was that it could only be applied to the elderly and the very ill. And so then came the introduction of Do Not Resuscitate, DNR notices, death sentences slammed on the medical records of countless millions of patients. When DNR notices were first introduced, the idea was to temper scientific advances with a little genuine kindness and concern for the welfare of patients. Medical science had reached a point whereby patients could be kept alive long after real hope had disappeared. In the beginning, DNR notices were introduced with good intentions. The idea was that patients who were dying and beyond help would not be resuscitated time and time again, simply delaying the inevitable and putting comatose patients and distraught relatives through endless pain. Around the world, millions of comatose and brain-dead patients would still be alive today, kept breathing by machines and without hope of recovery, if the principle of DNR had not been quietly introduced. But today, Do Not Resuscitate notices are routinely slapped on the medical notes of patients who are awaiting surgery for entirely curable problems or who are simply old, by which they mean they're over 50, or disabled, or ill, or suffering from mental illness. Even young adults and children have been labelled Do Not Resuscitate if a doctor or nurse felt that their lives were in some way worthless. The medical establishment had by then deliberately and cold-bloodedly taken the caring out of medicine. But the decline in caring came to a head during the COVID fraud. It was then that the medical establishment decided that the Liverpool care pathway wasn't killing people fast enough, and that the DNR notices just weren't fast enough either. Most people became aware that doctors were deliberately killing their patients during the COVID lockdowns of 2020, when doctors began systematically, deliberately, and cold-bloodedly murdering old people in care homes using a kill shot injection consisting of midazolam and morphine. What else do you call it but murder when patients are deliberately killed to save money? As I warned in February and March of 2020, the alleged COVID pandemic was a hoax. The science and the statistics showed that COVID was nothing more than a remarketed annual flu. It was no surprise that in 2020 there was no official flu. That's because everyone who had COVID actually had the flu. People forget that worldwide up to 600,000 people can die in an annual flu season. Governments around the world try to fiddle the figures to show that COVID was killing millions. It wasn't. People who died of heart attacks or cancer or accidents in the street were all put down as COVID victims. As everyone now knows, it was a massive fraud. The extra deaths were a result of the lockdowns, which were never justified, and later the toxic vaccine, which I had warned was coming right at the start of 2020. It was obvious too that they'd try to make it compulsory. The mass murder of the elderly was part of the depopulation plan. In March and April 2020, doctors said that they would simply refuse to see or treat old people. One GP told a care home manager that no one over the age of 75 would be admitted to hospital. Referrals by GPs for suspected cancer fell by 70%, as doctors abandoned their patients and their responsibilities. As the number of pensioners dying increased, government ministers openly boasted of the huge amounts of money that they were saving. They were saving on pensions that they didn't have to pay, and they were saving on medical care. The slaughter of the innocent, which occurred during 2020, was nothing more or less than a form of genocide. During the COVID lockdowns, launched in celebration of the remarketed, rebranded annual flu in 2020, thousands of old people were murdered. And that's not hyperbole. Thousands of elderly people were isolated from their families and friends and then deliberately murdered with kill shots of morphine and a benzodiazepine. The argument was that old people had to be kept out of hospitals so that the staff would be free to deal with younger patients who were suffering from COVID. I made a number of videos about the murders taking place in hospitals around the world back in 2020, and they were murders. What else do you call it when people are deliberately killed? Murder's murder, whether it's committed by a man with a gun or a nurse with a syringe. In fact, as is well known, doctors and nurses had so little to do during the COVID hoax that they spent their time rehearsing TikTok dance routines while the innocent elderly were being slaughtered. Specially built hospitals designed to cope with the avalanche of COVID patients were left empty and unused. Politicians boasted about the money that was being saved by killing off pensioners. Attempts to tell the truth about the deliberate cold-blooded fraud were suppressed by media organisations such as YouTube and the BBC, the staff of which will, in due course, be tried en masse for genocide. At least I hope so. I wouldn't trust medical advice by anyone now offering their views on these or any other mainstream channel. And now euthanasia, global doctor-assisted suicide, mercy killing, or whatever you want to call it, is being promoted globally. You know something's planned and bad when it's sudden and global. Every country which has introduced a euthanasia program of any kind has effectively abandoned any pretense at civilization. The people who promote euthanasia claim that there will be rules and regulations and restrictions which will ensure that only the terminally ill will be accepted for death by doctor. They talk of compassion and kindness, and they've done everything they can to try to grab the moral high ground, though the idea that any government would do anything designed to make people's lives better is, sadly, laughable. But I'm afraid that their intentions are built more on ignorance than kindness. Some supporting the plans for euthanasia have actually said that individuals should be allowed to die if they feel they have become a burden. Whenever and wherever euthanasia is introduced, the rules are abandoned or changed. It is not long before the service being promoted is available to the anxious, the depressed, the disabled, the unemployed and the poor. It will be available to the young and to the old, and it will be available to teenagers who are feeling down. More than half the UK population is officially a burden on the state. In other words, they receive more money in benefits than they pay in tax. They're the primary target of the government's plan to start the mass slaughter of citizens. No one promoting euthanasia or suicide by doctor seems to know or care that 9 out of 10 people who attempt suicide but fail subsequently live long, successful lives and regret having tried to kill themselves. And how many of those supporting euthanasia have taken the time to read the paper entitled "High Rates of Psychiatric Comorbidity Among Requesters of Medical Assistance in Dying, Results of a Canadian Prevalence Study"? The paper occurred back in 2021 and the researchers concluded patients with psychiatric comorbidity comprise a substantial proportion of patients requesting medical assistance in dying. The initial idea is always that euthanasia will be available only to patients who are at the end of a very long process of dying. The idea is that those patients will be liberated from their pain and suffering and will be allowed to die in quiet dignity. But that's not what happens. That's definitely not what happens. Look at every country which has introduced euthanasia. Look at Canada, where people are being murdered because they're jobless and poor and without hope. People are being killed for social reasons. Euthanasia will be available for patients with mental illness in 2027. Children with autism, Asperger's and ADHD will be quietly euthanized. School children who are miserable will be quietly euthanized without their parents' knowledge or consent. And it is, of course, all about money. Killing patients isn't about kindness, it's about saving money, and it's part of a well-documented plan to reduce the size of the world's population down to 500 million. There's no doubt that killing the long-term sick saves a lot of money. A Canadian Armed Forces veteran who was injured in Afghanistan has reported how at least 6 veterans in Canada have been offered euthanasia after asking for help. One asked for care and received a letter saying, "If it's too difficult for you to continue living, madam, we can offer you medical assistance in dying." One veteran called a crisis hotline and was offered assisted suicide as a solution. And this is already happening in the UK. A 25-year-old veteran was in crisis and asked for help. A doctor in the UK suggested assisted dying. In the UK, it's been claimed a euthanasia programme will save millions for the government and doubtless enable it to spend more money on bullets and bombs to kill more people. Modern politicians save money by killing people and then use the money they've saved to kill more people. Providing decent palliative care for those who are dying would be kinder, gentler and more in keeping with the tradition of healing. But